In May 1945, Nazi Germany capitulated, ending the European conflict. Yet for 5,000 American servicemen, the ordeal had not concluded. These men had been freed from German POW camps by the Red Army, and under the terms of the Yalta Accord, they ought to have been handed back to U.S. authorities without delay. That, however, did not happen. Instead, they remained confined within Soviet-occupied zones, beyond a curtain descending swiftly over Eastern Europe. By early June, word of these thousands of missing American POWs reached General Patton men who were not returning home. Patton immediately contacted Soviet headquarters, demanding the prisoners' swift release. The reply was evasive and steeped in bureaucracy. They are being processed and will be handed over once all paperwork is finished. As weeks dragged on with no sign of the men, Patton once more reached out to Soviet authorities. This time, the answer differed. We have no knowledge of any American prisoners within our zone. 5,000 soldiers had effectively vanished. Soviet documentation claimed these men never existed. Patton refused to accept this, holding files that listed every name, rank, unit, and the very camps from which they had been freed. He also possessed accounts from soldiers who had managed to flee Soviet custody and return to American lines, each describing the reality beyond Soviet checkpoints. These Americans were confined in camps, not as visitors, but as captives. They had simply exchanged one set of guards for another. Though the swastika had given way to the hammer and sickle, the barbed wire remained unchanged. Stalin's reply to Eisenhower was carefully diplomatic. There may be a misunderstanding. We are doing our best to locate any Americans. He was told that personnel procedures take time, but Patton had lost all patience. He called his senior staff together, and the subject was direct. 5,000 Americans remained in Soviet captivity, and Stalin would not release them. What were they going to do about it? Patton had already arrived at his decision. But before we continue, be sure to subscribe. This is the story of World War II's aftermath when the fighting stopped, yet prisoners remained trapped behind newly drawn frontiers. The Yalta Agreement, signed in February 1945 by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, left no room for ambiguity. Under Article 3, Section B, every prisoner of war freed by Allied forces was to be repatriated to their home nation as quickly as possible. Rapidly. That was the operative term. Not eventually, not when it suited them, but rapidly. The Soviets had signed, had consented, and then had turned their backs on the pledge. The initial reports emerged from Captain Robert Shaw, a former POW held in a German camp outside Dresden. His camp was liberated by Soviet troops on May 3rd. Shaw assumed he would be transported west to American lines and finally home, but he was instead marched eastward alongside 300 other Americans. They were assured this was only temporary, a brief stop for processing, medical checks, and paperwork. Their destination was a Soviet holding camp located 30 miles within Soviet-occupied Poland. What awaited them there was deeply puzzling. They were not subjected to cruelty. Food, bunks, and medical care were provided, yet none of them were permitted to leave. Armed Soviet sentries stood watch with their rifles. Whenever the Americans asked about returning home, Shaw noted the stock answer: "Soon. Be patient. Paperwork takes time." Something was clearly amiss. The camp's population kept growing, with fresh groups of American prisoners arriving every few days, each liberated by the Soviets, each hearing the same refrain: processing, documentation, soon. By late May, Shaw counted more than 1,000 Americans confined in his camp alone, and he had heard of other camps, similar circumstances scattered throughout Soviet-controlled territory. On May 28th, Shaw acted on his resolve and escaped. The escape proved surprisingly easy. Unlike their German predecessors, the Soviets did not guard the Americans with the same vigilance. The perimeter fencing stood, but it was not electrified, and the sentries were inattentive and lax. Under the cover of darkness, Shaw escaped, heading westward and steering clear of highways and villages alike. After 3 grueling days, he crossed into American territory, worn out, starving, yet finally free. His debriefing began at once, and the intelligence officer listening found the story almost impossible to accept. "Why are the Soviets detaining you?" Shaw had no answer. They claimed it was processing, but weeks had dragged on, and more Americans kept arriving. He began to suspect they were being gathered deliberately. The report climbed the command ladder: division, corps, army, until it landed on Patton's desk. After clearing his throat and reading Shaw's testimony, Patton summoned his intelligence chief, Colonel Oscar Koch. Patton demanded a number. Koch had been gathering intelligence from various channels, escapees, such as Shaw, indiscreet Soviet liaisons, Allied surveillance. Their estimate, between 4,000 and 6,000 American prisoners were being held by the Soviets, potentially more. Patton's jaw clenched. Despite that, they refused to release them? Correct, sir. Official requests have been sent repeatedly, yet Moscow continues to delay. But why? What's their objective? Koch paused. There was no clear answer. Certain officials believe they're bargaining chips for talks after the war. Others suspect Stalin's distrust of the West and his wish to keep American eyes away from whatever is occurring on Soviet land. Rising, Patton moved to the map on his office wall. There, dividing Germany's core, ran a vivid red boundary separating the American and Soviet sectors. Those men, Patton said in a low voice, endured the Germans. They deserve to return home. Turning to Koch, he ordered, compile a comprehensive list, every name, every American we know, the Soviets liberated, every camp location, every shred of evidence in our possession. I will formally demand their return, in writing, for the record. Koch set about preparing the paperwork. The effort consumed a week. The resulting document was enormous names, ranks, serial numbers, units, locations of German camps, dates of liberation, and sworn accounts from men who had fled. There were 5,270 Schafrained, documented, verified American servicemen still unaccounted for. Patton forwarded the roster via formal channels to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, along with the message for Eisenhower. The message requested immediate intervention with Soviet command, noting that 5,000 American POWs were unaccounted for, last seen in Soviet custody, and that the Yalta Agreement required their immediate return. Eisenhower forwarded this to the Soviet liaison. The answer came 3 days later, polite and diplomatic. We have examined American claims. No evidence exists of American prisoners in our sector. All released persons have been processed and delivered to the appropriate Allied authorities. If the Americans think otherwise, they are mistaken. Patton scanned the message, read it once more, then hurled it across the office. They're lying. We hold names and witnesses, yet they insist these men never existed, Patton countered. His chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, tried to pacify him. Sir, this now falls to diplomacy. SHAEF will take charge and conduct the negotiations. And as they talk, our men remain trapped in Soviet camps, asking why nobody has come for them. Patton moved across the room, mulling and strategizing, yet he had been commanded not to antagonize the Soviets. With the war against Japan still unresolved, the coalition hung by a thread. The American-Soviet partnership served mutual strategy, yet 5,000 Americans languished once more imprisoned, this time under unfamiliar guards. Patton reached a decision. Get me Colonel Waters. Patton's own son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters, had only recently been freed from a German prisoner of war camp. He knew the anguish of captivity, the interminable wait for liberation, the gnawing uncertainty of whether anyone was coming. Waters arrived in under an hour. John, Patton said, I need you to handle something unofficially. As Patton outlined the situation, the Soviet refusal, the diplomatic deadlock, Waters listened. I need eyes on those camps. I have to know if our boys are actually there. Waters asked about their condition and why the Soviets were holding them. Patton wanted him to cross into Soviet territory, but only to get close enough to confirm. Escaped prisoners have provided locations. I need verification, something tangible to press the matter. Waters understood. This was no official order. For Waters, this was personal. He gathered a small team, intelligence officers, Russian speakers, men capable of blending in and moving without a trace. They slipped into Soviet-controlled Poland on June 18th, dressed as civilians, with no insignia, no identification, only maps, coordinates, and a mission. 3 days later, they discovered the first camp. The place matched Shaw's description exactly. A former German installation, now converted to a different purpose. Soviet guards stood at the entrance. Inside were Americans, hundreds of them. They wore an odd mix of uniforms, some American, some German, whatever had been issued, yet undeniably American. Waters watched them through his binoculars. He documented everything, photographing from a distance. He counted the prisoners in view and recorded the camp's layout, the guard rotations, and the conditions. He moved on to the next location, then the next. By June 25th, Waters had verified 4 camps. The estimated total, more than 3,000 Americans. They were well-fed and healthy, but certainly not free, and certainly not being processed for return. On June 27th, Waters made it back to American lines and reported directly to Patton. "They're there, all of them," Waters told Patton, "and the Soviets are lying." Patton gathered the report, the photographs, and the documentation, and forwarded everything to Eisenhower with a new message. "We have physical confirmation. American prisoners of war were in Soviet custody, a direct violation of the Yalta Agreement. Recommend immediate escalation to the highest authorities." This time, Eisenhower acted. He contacted Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, directly the most senior Soviet commander in Europe, and Eisenhower's counterpart. The meeting was tense. Eisenhower presented the evidence: Waters' photographs, a list of names, and testimony from escaped prisoners. Zhukov listened, his face unreadable. "These camps are temporary holding facilities for displaced persons," he said. "Some may be American. We are identifying them. It takes time. There are millions of people displaced by this war. Sorting them out is complex." Eisenhower shot back. "The Yalta Agreement says rapidly." Eisenhower pressed. "It's been 2 months," Zhukov responded, "and it will be handled properly through channels." Eisenhower left the meeting frustrated. The Soviets were stonewalling, and officially, there was little he could do. But Patton wasn't bound by such diplomatic constraints. When Eisenhower briefed him on Zhukov's response, Patton erupted. "Complex? Sorting them out is complex? They're in American uniforms, speaking English. How complex is that? George, we have to tread carefully. The alliance is finished. The war in Europe had been won, but Stalin was already treating Americans as enemies, with 5,000 of their men still in his grasp." Eisenhower let out a heavy sigh. "What is it you intend to do?" Patton answered without hesitation. "I intend to go get our men. You cannot invade Soviet territory. I'm not speaking of invasion, I'm speaking of presence. We position our units along the border, make it unmistakable that we know exactly where our boys are, and we will not stand down until they are handed over." The word returned hung in the air. It was a gamble, one that risked escalation, yet Eisenhower grasped Patton's logic. Diplomacy had failed. Perhaps a demonstration of strength would succeed. "Move your forces, but do not cross the line. Do not engage Soviet troops. This is pressure, not provocation." Patton saluted crisply. "Understood." Within 72 hours, elements of the Third Army had shifted into position along the Soviet frontier. The deployment of tanks and artillery was unmistakably deliberate, and the Soviets took note at once. Marshal Zhukov reached out to Eisenhower with a pointed question. "Why are American forces gathering on our border?" Eisenhower chose his reply with precision. "General Patton is worried about the American prisoners in your hands. He is determined to see them safely returned. This has the appearance of a threat. Call it a reminder of the commitments we made under Yalta." The pressure proved effective. Within a week, the first batch of Americans was freed, 200 men delivered to American lines, healthy, grateful, and finally home. Patton greeted them in person, pressing for details about their treatment, the camps, and the reasons for their captivity. The responses he gathered were uniform. The Soviets harbored deep distrust of Americans and had no intention of letting outsiders witness the realities of Soviet-controlled territory, the living conditions, and the manner in which local people were being handled. This was the dawn of the Iron Curtain, and Stalin wanted no witnesses to what lay behind it. Over the following month, releases trickled out in batches, slow, yet steady. By August 1945, 4,800 Americans had come back, though not all. 200 remained unaccounted for, and Patton never ceased his pursuit. Patton continued to press, but the diplomatic landscape had already transformed. The alliance was unraveling, and the Cold War was silently taking shape. Some of those men were never found, and their families received the grim notification: missing, status unknown. Yet Patton was certain they had been held in Soviet camps, and Stalin steadfastly refused to acknowledge it. The former prisoners who reached home never forgot Patton, the general who refused to leave them behind. He had rolled tanks to the border and insisted on their release. Among them was Captain Robert Shaw, the same man who had escaped to carry the truth to the outside world. In 1945, he paid Patton a visit. "Thank you, sir," he said, "for never giving up on us." Patton met his gaze. "You are American soldiers. I was never going to leave you behind. What would you have done if 5,000 of your own men were being held by an ally who had turned into an enemy?" Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like more stories from World War II, those moments when victory was tangled up in politics, be sure to subscribe.